Good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is September 3rd public training. We're going to review version 3.5.0 products that are coming your way and being released. We've got three great presenters with us this morning, Dr. Mann, Laurel Baeder, and Josh Legler. And they're just going to go through an overview of changes that are coming down the pike for version 3.5.0. If you've got questions or you need clarification on something that they're discussing, please feel free to unmute yourself and to ask the question. Use the chat feature, and I'll be watching that, so we'll try and capture all of those questions as well. But we appreciate you taking time out of your schedule, and we will go ahead and get started with Dr. Clay Mann. He is going to start us off on this conversation this morning for overview of 3.5 products. Clay, it is all yours.
Great, thank you, Julianne. Really appreciate the introduction and welcome to the public training today. Lots of new names on the list of participants. We welcome you here to talk about the current candidate release for NEMSIS. So we're about 2.5 years into the process of really actively working to take a look at the current NEMSIS standard and determine if there's areas where we could make some revisions that would be helpful to the field providers, the clinicians actually working the street. The overall mantra of this review was how can we make the standard less complex and more user-friendly for completion of patient care reports in the field. That's kind of a two-tiered approach, right? One is to make the standard more user-friendly, but then also to work with our vendors to see if we can make their presentations of the standard also more user-friendly. So this is the half of that full process, really moving to the to version 3.5.0. So we have gone through, as I mentioned, 2.5 years of vetting, balloting, and working together to make 3.5 better and easier to use. It's currently out in candidate release on the NEMSIS website, and Laurel, who will be finishing up the presentation today, will have a link there where you can go and take a look at any of the candidate release products just to review. As I mentioned briefly before many folks were on the call, I was talking to Doug from Nebraska. We currently are in the candidate review of the 3.5 products. That closes this month, which just basically means that we're making all of the revisions now that were associated with the review period. But if you have comments after going through the products that you find on the website, if you have comments, we of course always welcome those. So that just is a quick introduction. So let's go ahead and go through kind of an accounting of what happened in regards to the revision process. We're currently on the streets. NEMSIS has a version 3.3.4 that folks are using, but clearly the most prominent one is the most recent, which is version 3.4.0. So this would be the next iteration of the standard, which would be released the end of this month, and we can go through the timeline if folks are interested in kind of understanding that better. So let me see if I can get the slides to move forward here. I may be going too quickly here. Here we go. Okay. All right, so let's just go through the process. Just in summary, there were 126 submitted revision requests that were made during the open call for suggestions. Some of those revision requests were large, that is, they had lots of revision requests within an individual request, and so there were clearly more individual revisions than 126. Those requests were all balloted. 61 of those 126 were balloted as not in scope for this revision process. 27 were just outright declined, were just changes that were not going to happen. 29 were deferred. That means that they were kind of futuristic approaches to the NEMSIS standard, so they would be deferred to a future release. And then there were 5 that were just really pretty simple technical fixes to documentation. So we just went ahead and made those. So 5 were just made shortly after they were requested. 65 were balloted to move forward. Here's kind of the breakdown of what those revision requests look like. 12 of them would either add or remove an element from the NEMSIS standard. 32 would add or remove a value within an element. 9 were just definitional changes, and 12 were technical fixes. We had an independent working paramedic take a look at those 65 requests for changes and just indicate whether he thought if that change was made, if it would improve the provider experience, if it would really have no change on their experience, or if it might impact their experience as they're completing a patient care report. And you can see that 34 would improve, 20 would have no change, and 11 would have some impact. All this work resulted in really 264 revisions to the standard. I'm just going to go over some highlights, some assorted highlights that are probably important for folks to understand with this candidate release. One of the calls that was important to us was to reduce the number of national elements. What national elements means is within the NEMSIS standard, there are elements that are mandatory or required to be completed. And so that it's completed by every paramedic on the street or every clinician, and then those elements are passed up to the state, and they end up in a national repository that's used for research or for performance measures. But there was a lot of them, and so could we reduce the number of those? And so we were able to reduce those by 10. But and then there were some other kind of added or promoted elements that I just wanted to go through just kind of quickly, just to help you understand how changes were made to improve the use of the standard with our clinicians. So you'll notice that they're color-coded. So those elements that are purple are optional, meaning states or agencies don't need to choose to collect that element. Recommended elements are also states and providers don't need to collect them, but often states feel like these are recommended to be collected. The bulk of states thought that. And then there's required and mandatory elements that are either red or orange. These are the national elements that actually come up to a national level. So let's go through these just real quickly. So we added an E times element, E times 17. This was an element that was added simply because there were a number of requests that indicated that more often now than in the past, an EMS unit will be asked just to arrive at a staging area, and they'd like to be able to record that date and time before they actually are on scene. So that element was added. E-patient 22 alternate home address was added, so clinicians could indicate whether or not a patient was homeless or a foreign visitor, and I would point to the fact that they were not able to collect a home residence.
Yeah, first
or
optional. Or
if folks would be so kind as to mute their phones, we're getting some background noise. Thank you. The e-exam section, chest and lung assessments were combined in the current version 3.4. So if you were trying to indicate some anatomical abrasion or laceration to the chest, it was in the same element that included whether or not you were indicating that the patient was experiencing rails or some other type of lung issue. So those have been separated out into 2 separate exam assessments. And that is, of course, an optional element. E-situation 18 was an optional element. It has been promoted to be a required element. That is, it has to be assessed with every patient. But what we're doing there is applying business rules to E-situation 18 that would help the providers to indicate that this is an element that needs to be completed when there's a time-sensitive issue. So a cardiac arrest, a stroke, or a severe trauma, something like that would help with Utstein criteria for cardiac arrest or for requirements for stroke or STEMI. So we're hoping that it remains not burdensome because I'll have business rules that will just associate when it should be completed and when it can be left blank. We're still getting some feedback. If folks would be so kind as to mute their phones, that would be really helpful. All right,
I think we had a question.
Oh, sure.
Did somebody have a question that they wanted to ask Clay before he moves on to the next slide?
Okay, well, if you have a question, yeah, please feel free to ask it. I'll work down through the rest of these. So eHistory .20 was added. In the history section, we indicated what medications the patient was currently on, what was the dosage, but we did not, for some reason, indicate the frequency with which the medication is taken. So that element has been added. Other 22 was also added. We have a complete section in NEMSIS associated with the process of attaching a file to the patient care report. So say you wanted to include an ECG with the patient care report, your software products allow you to do that, but we did not have an element that indicates the name of the attached file, so that element was also added. Those are both optional. eMedications 04 was an existing element in the NEMSIS standard associated with giving medications to a provider. We have promoted this element from optional to required that indicates the administered route of the medication. Again, it's required to indicate whether a medication was given and the dosage and dosage units, but we did not have route. Scene 24 was added. This is an element that is associated with the use of CARES, and so within many of your states you may be participating in the cardiac arrest registry called CARES. This was an element that was added to support that effort. It's optional. And then eDisposition 12 has been a really problematic element in 3.4. It was an element used to describe the disposition of the crew, of the patient, of the unit, all in one element. That's been split out. Now eDisposition 12 will go away, that element, and there's 4 elements now that allow you to quickly identify the type of call, the incident, or the disposition of the crew, of the patient, of the scene, all within this group. And I've kind of made it red and orange because there's one element in there that's mandatory and then the other 3 are required. We did a lot of experimentation with this group, and we're hoping that it will actually be easier to complete this than to have to work your way through the eDisposition 12 now, which I think has 30 plus choices. So it was very hard to work through that element. And then eDisposition 32 was added also to the eDisposition section that indicates if there was a level of care that was provided per protocol. So I'm going to go on to the next slide here, see if I can get this to move forward. Okay, oh, well, there we go. Now it's paying attention to me. Okay, all right. So some other assorted highlights, and so as folks know, there are business rules associated with the completion of a patient care report. If you just by chance reported a pregnant male, for example, that error would be reported to you in a business rule, and you'd be asked if that was a choice you wanted to make or whether you need to correct it. Those rules are now associated with the data dictionary, so you can actually see which rules apply to which elements. That should be helpful. There was also suggested lists associated with a number of NEMSIS elements that could be quite lengthy. For example, cause of injury had lots and lots of choices. The NEMSIS TAC has put together a suggested list kind of asking states to consider using these lists to standardize, for example, the cause of injury that can be recorded across the country. We've shortened those lists substantially. So you can see in 2017, the initial list we put out had really 144 codes in kind of a 2-tier system. So in the first tier, you might indicate that it's a fall. And then there, if you pressed fall, then there may be many subcodes like a same level fall or a fall from a height that might appear for you to be able to choose from. Well, we actually took all of the cause of injuries that were reported in 2017 through 2019 and then redid those lists so that all the lists are now shorter. For example, cause of injury drops from 144 codes to 80 codes, but we ensured that it captured at least 90% of all of the causes of injury that have been reported during those 3 years that I reported. So those, that should be helpful as well to kind of reduce the burden of looking through those exhaustive lists. The state data set now becomes part of the NEMSIS standard. The state data set, just a quick description, is a subset of data that should be used by vendor products to populate within the products that you're using any state required information. So the list of facilities for which you can present patients to, their addresses and their geolocations, the EMS providers within their states and their geolocations. All that information should self-populate into the products that you're using. We have an e-outcome section in NEMSIS that really, it's where we're trying to get hospitals to report through health information exchanges the outcome of your patients that you deliver directly back into the NEMSIS standard, so directly back into your data set. That was overly complex in the past, so we've really simplified that section to try to get more kind of participation among health information exchanges across the country. We've removed business rules that were related to non-national elements. Those were a bit confusing for states. And then you may recall that the business rules in the past one error could be related to several different elements that you tried to complete during your record. Those were kind of called pattern or pattern-based error rules. We have no more pattern-based rules, they're all atomics, and so there's an individual statement associated with every potential error that we want to check and make sure is correct. So the messages that you get back should be much more straightforward. Let's cover just quickly the things that may remain a little bit controversial. E-patient 13, it was patient sex, was clearly just anatomical sex in the past. We received a number of requests to have gender identification included in the NEMSIS standard. Do we need to add another element for gender identification? What we ended up doing after much debate was just changing e-patient 13 to include sex and a handful of gender identification elements. There was over 15 different gender identification elements that were requested to be added, and we did not add all those. We added some high-level ones. I'm going to check the chat real quick. It looks like there's some questions. Let me see if I can.
There is, Clay. There's one for you about the state data sets. Will they now be expected to be consumed and change configurations?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so there will be an expectation that field level products can consume a state data set that is produced by a state, yes. And where there'll be ability to change configurations. I think that has remained true for the bulk of products that have been able to consume a state data set. That's actually caused some difficulty. People have changed, for example, the names of facilities from those reported by states. We're still trying to work out the details to make this work more seamlessly, and that's one of the additional kind of business decisions we'll be making over the next couple of months to ensure that we can implement this correctly. Yeah, great question. Okay. The second controversial thing, there was a request to add patient height and length to the e-exam section. That actually was not added, and there's a lengthy debate about that you can find on the website. E-procedures and e-airway, there was a call to combine those two. The e-airway section, of course, could include attributes or procedures that are done to secure an airway of a patient. So really, when an airway needed to be secured, you had to report those twice, right, in the e-airway section as well as the e-procedure section. those were not combined. There was just not a clean way to do that, so that was actually moved to a future generation. So, so in those rare circumstances, it will be necessary to report an airway basically twice. We also reinstituted a previously deprecated element. We had removed ERS 010, which is therapeutic hypothermia treatment for cardiac arrest, because of that very problem that could be reported here in ERS 10, and then in the e-procedure section, you may again indicate that you provided this type of therapy. CARES, to adhere to CARES, the cardiac arrest registry that many states are using, it was reinstituted, and so in those rare occasions, again, it will be necessary in a slightly different form to be able to indicate the use of hypothermia twice. So those are the controversial issues that probably still remain somewhat present in the standard. Okay, now I'm going to try to move forward to the next slide here. Okay, there are some items that will require some additional education. So the e-disposition section, as I mentioned, e-disposition 12 has been changed to 4 elements. There'll be some education required to make that work quickly and seamlessly. Really think it's going to be an incredibly strong improvement, but we want to make sure that there's good education associated with the use of that section. Folks may also recognize that we use pertinent negatives in the NEMSIS standard. So for e-medications 03, which is just what medications did you give, there's a way to indicate, for example, that I did not give aspirin for a patient with chest pain because they have an allergy to aspirin, for example. So a pertinent negative could indicate why you did not give a medication. There's also an ability to use a pertinent negative to indicate why you didn't complete an element. So for e-patient 02, which is patient's last name, you could indicate pertinent negative as the patient refused to give me the patient's last name, so you wouldn't provide a value for their last name, and you would just indicate that the patient refused. Now, with version 3.5, there's also a situation where you can use a pertinent negative with or without a value. That's situation 1, the time that symptoms began. So you may provide a value and then just indicate with a pertinent negative that this is an estimate of the time that it started, or the patient may refuse to give you a value, and so again it would be without a value, and you would just indicate refused. So it'll be helpful to provide some education on the use of pertinent negatives. Entitled CO2 also has an attribute now associated with that element that lets you indicate what type of measurement was associated with the entitled CO2 measurement. And then the e-arrest section that is associated with cardiac arrest, it now has slightly different definitions for those elements, and they align more carefully with the CARES registry, so that'll be important to take a look at. That is a quick overview of the changes and revisions that are associated with the Canada Release 3.5.0. So before I turn it over to Josh to talk a little bit about a unique identifier we're adding to the NEMSIS standard, are there any questions about the process of developing the Canada Release? Okay, Josh, I'll turn the time over to you, and feel free to take control of the screen.
Okay, thanks, Clay. This is Josh. Thanks, everyone, for joining this call this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are. One of the big ideas of additions to NEMSIS 3.5 will be the introduction of a UUID, which stands for Universally Unique Identifier. Make sure my controls work here. There we go. UUIDs will be added to some data elements that I'll show you in a second. They will be mandatory. They'll be auto-generated by local systems working at the agency level. They will be used by state and national level systems as keys or identifiers for objects in demographic data and for patient care reports. When a UUID is generated, it will never change after it has been generated for an object. UUIDs have no business meaning. They're auto-generated using an algorithm. You can see down at the bottom of the screen there a sample UUID that was generated using the algorithm. UUIDs are an under-the-hood change, a technical level change that are going to make it easier for state-level systems to process incoming demographic data and patient care reports, to understand, for example, when a personnel or a vehicle within an agency is modified. Currently, it can be hard for a receiving system to recognize which object was modified, especially if things like the personnel's name and birth date and state license number were all changed. Then the state system really has no idea, no way of knowing that this is the same person that was submitted a week ago with a different name, different ID, and a different birth date, potentially. So by adding a UUID to that personnel record, then the receiving system now knows this is the object, I've seen this object before, and now I can compare the data that I have to the data I'm receiving from the agency and update the object appropriately. So as I said, it's an under-the-hood change that should not be visible to end users, to EMS providers. They really shouldn't have any interaction with these UUIDs. It's all a technical level change to allow for better processing of data as it gets sent from one level to the next in a NEMSIS kind of environment. So UUIDs will be added in the demographic data set to all of these repeating groups that have elements within them. So you'll see the examples here of like a vehicle group or personnel group. And then even within a personnel group, a person can have multiple immunizations with different dates recorded. They can have multiple state licensures. They can have multiple agency specific certification levels. And so each of those repeating groups within demographics will be given a UUID attribute so that they can be tracked over time as they change. In the patient care report data, just the patient care report itself will have a UUID added to it to allow us to better track uniqueness of patient care reports, even when things within the report change, like the time the unit was notified or which unit responded to the call. Everything within the patient care report could be modified, and we would still know that it's the same report because that UUID will not be modified. There will be a Schematron rule in the national rule set that will check to make sure that the same UUID does not occur more than once within a demographic report, which represents an agency. The same UUID could occur in two different agencies. For example, if the same person works for two different agencies and both of those agencies use the same software installation, then that person may be identified with the same UUID in each of those two agencies, and that would be allowed. But you cannot have the same person listed twice within one agency with the same UUID. That would generate a Schematron error in the national Schematron rules. See if I can get my mouse control back here. There we go. Then outside of demographics, as I mentioned, patient care reports will be identified by a unique ID. They'll still be identified by their agency as they are today, but then within that agency, the UUID will be the single unique identifier for a patient care report in the agency. And it will replace this combination of three elements that are currently used today, which is patient care report number, EMS call sign, and unit notified by dispatch date time. These have been a little problematic because the date time may be corrected. Sometimes it's a time zone issue that gets corrected, or the date gets corrected. Sometimes even the unit call sign gets corrected on a call. So the record gets submitted one way, and then it gets resubmitted a day or two later and is seen as a new record, a new patient care report by receiving systems because they're using these elements as keys. Now they can rely on the UUID, and everything within the report could be modified, and the receiving system would still understand which report is being updated. There was some discussion about why we don't just change the patient care report number to be a UUID, and that would affect existing implementations. So it would be a change to an existing data element that could be problematic, especially for historical data. So we are adding the attribute instead. Some systems, in fact, do use the patient care report number in a meaningful way. It may consist of a date and a time and stuff like that, whereas the UUID has no business meaning whatsoever and is generated according to an algorithm. There are a few issues to be aware of with the introduction of UUIDs. One is issues with translation of NEMSIS data from one version to another. It will be possible to take 3.5.0 data and translate it to 3.4.0 using an XML transformation. And the NEMSIS TAC will provide those transformation resources. However, it will not be possible to take a record that was created in an earlier version of NEMSIS and translate it up to 3.5.0. And that is, at least not through an XML transformation process. And that is because the XML transformation process has no way to generate a UUID and then make sure that that UUID would be the same every time the data is translated in the future. It can't do that for the same reasons that receiving systems today can't really understand what was changed versus what was added or removed in demographic data. So for a software system to translate from 3.4 to 3.5, that translation would have to happen internally in the software product, where the software product would have to assign new UUIDs to all objects and then export the data in 3.5 format. So the translation would require additional steps.
Hey, Josh.
Yes.
This is Doug. So when you guys get done, really the map that maps the two systems together is going to be 3.5 to 3.4.
Yeah, the NEMSIS TAC will also provide a mapping from 3.4 to 3.5 because it'll cover all the stuff, you know, like incident patient disposition and how that gets mapped into the 3.5 values. However, it will not be able to create a valid 3.5 file because it won't have those UUIDs.
Right. Right. I'm just thinking of, you know, future data, how we're going to do epi stuff and, you know, all that type of thing.
Yeah, right. So a lot of that kind of thing will happen internal in your system, in your data warehousing process, to merge the multiple versions of NEMSIS into one source that you can go to for reporting.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Another issue is when agencies switch vendors. UUIDs will be generated by the local software, the agency level software. So if the agency switches to a different vendor product from one vendor to another, then that new product may be set up from scratch by the agency. And when they put in all their personnel, vehicles, et cetera, all of those objects are going to get new UUIDs assigned by the new software that the agency switched to. And the first time that the agency sends demographic data to their state after making that switch, the state system will perceive that as that the agency got rid of all their personnel and vehicles and everything else and acquired all new personnel, vehicles, et cetera, because they'll all have new UUIDs. There is a workaround for that for systems that are capable of receiving demographic data in the NEMSIS format. Then the old system could export its data and the new system could import the data that was exported from the old system. If that approach is taken, then UUIDs would be preserved, but the NEMSIS standard will not require that approach to be used because there is no requirement currently that local level systems be able to import demographic data. Lastly, another issue to be aware of is personnel records in state systems. Because the UUID is unique within an agency using a software product, that means that if a person works for multiple agencies within a state, and those agencies use different software products, then those different software products will assign their own unique identifier to the person. So even though it's the same person in real life, each object in the database representing that personnel record in the 2 or 3 different agencies. Each one will have its own UUID. So when that data is submitted to the state level, the state system, it helps the state system because it can track that person within the agency. But for the state system to recognize that that's the same person in agency A that also works for agency B or agency C, that takes additional work and matching on the part of the state system. So the UUID does not completely solve that issue of looking at personnel across different agencies using different products. Okay, I think this is where I'll pause. Yeah, before I go on to Schematron, any questions on the introduction of the unique identifier in NEMSIS 3.5? Okay, great. My second topic that I'll cover is the Schematron updates. Clay gave a high-level overview of some updates we're making here. I'll go into a little more detail with some examples. So first of all, there's not much in the way of requirements changes with the implementation of Schematron as a part of NEMSIS. The one significant, maybe technical requirement change is that the international standard for Schematron was released in 2006, and then it was updated in 2016. So in NEMSIS 3.5, we will support the 2016 update of the international Schematron standard. There is a document that outlines that standard, and within that document, it has some notes, well, just a handful of notes that talk about features that were not part of the 2006 version. The new version is backwards compatible, meaning that any Schematron schema that was created previously would still be valid and would still meet the standard in the future. The new standard implements or introduces a few new optional elements that are probably unlikely to be used in the NEMSIS environment, but would be allowed. So there is that update, but low impact there. Okay, changes in the national Schematron rules. One is the data dictionary integration that Clay mentioned. On every page of the data dictionary in NEMSIS 3.5, you will now be able to see down at the bottom any associated validation rules associated with that data element. We think this will make it much easier to understand and know what validation rules are in effect element by element. So we think that'll be a big usability improvement. Second, we are shortening the technical assertion IDs, mostly an under the hood thing, but we used to have long IDs like this that tried to encapsulate some meaning, some indication of what the rule was about. But now we're just going to go to numbered rules. For example, E means that it's going to be an EMS data set, the patient care report data, and then it's just numbered 068. So this will be much shorter. You won't be able to tell what the rule pertains to just by looking at its ID, but it'll be a lot handier when you're talking with other people and you say, oh, it's the EMS rule number 68. That's the one I'm having problems with. We did change the approach to fatal versus error versus warning rules in the national Schematron schemas. As a reminder, if a fatal or error is triggered, then a receiving system must reject the record or even the entire data submission. If only warnings are issued, then the receiving system must accept the data. And we have turned down some errors to warnings from NEMSIS 3.4 to NEMSIS 3.5. The approach we've used now is that errors are only reserved for issues that are likely due to a software misconfiguration. This is an example here. When an element has a not value, it should be empty. That's something that, if that gets triggered, it was probably an issue in the software product, the software design itself that needs to be addressed. Everything else, that's likely to be due to a user mistake is implemented now as a warning. So for example, type of destination should be recorded when the transport disposition is transport by the CMS unit. That's something that the user may have indicated that they transported and then left the type of destination blank, and that's going to come through as a warning, not an error. The feedback and request from states was that they would rather be more lenient and receive more data than to have to reject data and not even have it in their database at all. Next change, the national Schematron rules will only deal with national data elements. So for example, this rule gets taken out, the one that says that date and time of medical device event should be no earlier than arrive at patient. Medical device event is an optional element, not a national element. There are two exceptions. We do have validation rules around nil, not value, and pertinent negative combinations, and those apply to every data element that has nils, not values, or pertinent negatives, even if it's not a national element. And second, the rules about UUIDs will apply to every group element that should have a UUID, regardless of whether it's a national element. As Clay mentioned, the assertions are being made more atomic. Oh, sorry, I want to back up. I have the chat question from Ridgely. Why are you not using errors if the elements are nationally required? That certainly was the philosophy that we used in previous versions of the standard. Let me see if I can get back up to that slide here. No, it keeps keep losing control here. Let's see if I can get there. There we go. So the previous philosophy was, hey, if it's a national element and is marked as required, then conditionally it should be in fact required. So type of destination is a national element, and certainly when you transported, then you should record type of destination because it is a national element. But as I said, the consensus and the conversation, the direction that it took was that most states said, hey, even if that is left blank, we would rather be able to at least receive the data. And we want them to know that you know, we want that warning there, but we would at least like to receive the data and not have to reject the report because of that element being left blank. So that was the change in kind of the philosophical approach. Okay, so back to this change. We had rules in 3.4.0 and earlier along these lines. When cardiac arrest is yes, the following should be recorded. And it would list out whatever had not been recorded on that patient care report. So if cardiac arrest etiology was the only thing that was left blank, that's the only thing that would be shown. But if 3 or 4 things were left blank, those 3 or 4 things would be listed here in one message for the provider to go fix. That is being changed. That approach is moving to this way in 3.5, where we are going to have an individual message for each thing that was left blank. So in the past, if the person left all 5 of these elements blank, then they would get 1 error message listing all 5. Today, they're going to get 5 error messages, or in the future, in 3.5, they'll get 5 error messages, each message just pertaining to an individual data element. This was requested because people feel like this approach makes the rules easier to understand, more self-contained, and that's thus the word atomic that we're using. It's more tightly scoped with each rule. Okay, we have also rephrased the text of the assertions. We have tried to put the element that most likely needs to be addressed to be right at the beginning of the text. So that's the first thing the provider sees, is probably the thing they need to go fix. And we have added a few new assertions to the 3.5 national rules, some that we've identified from doing a full data dictionary review, and others that we're adding because of new data elements or new attributes that are being added to the standard. And lastly, because StateDataSet is now part of the standard as a mandatory thing to be generated by state systems, there is now a national Schematron schema to check some validation constraints on those state data sets that are generated by state systems. Okay, so before I hand it over to Laurel, any questions on the changes to Schematron with NEMSIS 3.5? Let's see, we had a question in the chat. What does nationally required actually mean if it's not enforced and it's contingently required by the individual states? So at a technical level, the fact that something is a national element means that that element will be included in the XML document that is generated and sent. If the element was not collected, set to not applicable or not recorded, then that is indicated, but the element itself is still in the XML data, even if it is empty. So that's the kind of the technical level definition with the word required. But at a practical level, yes, someone may still leave the element blank. They are going to get a warning about it because it is a national element and it is required. But they would technically be able to leave it blank and out it goes in the XML data and still be valid. All right, any other questions on Schematron? Great, I'll hand it over to Laurel.
Okay, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me now.
Yes, you're good.
Great, great. I was stuck on mute. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the changes to compliance testing for 3.5. If I can get the slideshow to work. Okay, so the first thing is the state data set. So as previously mentioned, state data set is going to become a mandatory part of the standard. So what this means is that as a part of compliance testing, we're going to test collect data products, agency software, on its ability to use a state data set in some way, and we're going to test receive and process systems, state systems, on their ability to generate a state data set. So that's the first big thing. Hopefully, a lot of collect data systems are already using state data set in some way, so this isn't too much of a reach. So an additional requirement for state systems is they'll also be required to be tested on their ability to generate a Schematron file. Now again, we already know that some state systems are doing this, at least to some degree. This Schematron can be kind of complicated, so this probably won't be entirely comprehensive, but we will look for some ability to generate some basic rules. The other big thing that we're going to start doing is retesting and recertification. This has been a really common request over the last year or so to require or provide a better avenue for retesting for compliance and recertification. So previously we had required that software come and retest at every major revision, and we had rarely seen software products come and be retested. So under 3.5, we're going to require that software be retested every 2 years or at every major revision, whichever comes sooner. This requirement won't extend to 3.4. It'll just be for version 3.5 and moving onward from there. So going along with that, we're going to have a formal retesting process available for 3.4 and 3.5 beginning on January 1st, 2020. And we'll also have new compliance test cases that will be available every year to sort of facilitate these recertifications and ensure that everyone is staying up to date with any, as their software moves through any changes. Compliance testing for 3.5 is going to open by the end of November of this year as well. So the last thing we're doing as for compliance testing on 3.5 is to review all our documentation and make sure everything is revised and up to date. Probably the biggest change here is going to be our use of the phrase market ready to describe at what stage software should be at before they present for testing. And we're trying to figure out how to use maybe different language here or dial in this requirement so that we get products presenting for testing that are really ready to be tested. In the past, we've seen a lot of software that is somewhat incomplete, where the vendors are asking us to test them for compliance, and it's kind of hard to do because they haven't, for example, set up Schematron validation yet. So we're going to work on tightening that language up so that it better represents where we want software to be before it's tested. That doesn't mean that we're not available to help with technical issues in software development. I'm always open to answering any questions about Schematron or XSDs or any part of the NEMSIS standard. But when software presents for testing, we really want it to be complete and ready to go, ready for use by providers. I think that's my last slide on compliance testing. I'm sure there are questions. Does anyone have any questions on compliance testing? I don't know why, but I cannot see the chat window anymore.
There are no questions in the chat yet, Laurel.
Awesome. Okay. I don't understand, but when I use Zoom, all of a sudden I can't see any of the little controls for mute, chat, or any of that anymore. Okay, so I'm going to move on to state data set changes. We already touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to kind of get into the details here. Okay, so the biggest and most apparent change is going to be that everything was renamed and renumbered. And this was done mostly to sort of signify that the state data set is now its own data set rather than a collection of elements pulled from the demographic data set and EMS data set. So, for example, the D agency group in state data set is now the S agency group. This doesn't mean the elements themselves have changed, just the names. S agency 01 is still exactly the same as D agency 01. It has the same constraints, the same sort of requirements. Its definition is a little bit different just to reflect which data set it's in, but it should be still a seamless transition to pull the value from S agency 01 into an agency's D agency 01 value. And that's true for facilities, custom elements, and all of the other state data set groups. Second change to state data set is the requirement of submission via web services. So now that state data set is sort of a full member of the NEMSIS standard family, we're going to require that it be submitted to the TAC via web services, just like demographic and EMS files. This is going to facilitate faster distribution of this data to agency products and just give us a better ability to validate these files and ensure everything is exactly as it should be. You know, no one's going to have to wait for me to post it to the Git repository and check it. It'll go there automatically if it passes XSD validation and Schematron. So we're hoping that this helps for a smoother transmission of information from states, the TAC, to agencies, and all around. Going along with this, we're also going to ask that the state software info is now included in state data set. We've added a section of elements called S software, where in state data set, the software company name, product name, and version number can be recorded, kind of like the software section in eRecord for an ePCR. This is primarily to help the NEMSIS TAC work better with states and state vendors and to allow us to provide more accurate and robust reporting to states and state vendors about the files they're submitting. We're really hoping this is going to help us all have a better working relationship so that when we have problems that we can get to the bottom of them a little faster. So this kind of leads me to some last questions about state data set and state resources. So the current process that we have for distributing these resources is using our Git repositories and the NEMSIS TAC website. So I want to know if this is working for states, agencies, and vendors, or if there's a different way that you would want to see us distribute this data, or if there are any other challenges to this that we have not considered or addressed that you would like to see addressed. Okay, so hearing no complaints, we're just gonna continue doing this in this way, and hopefully try and provide better resource to people in the future. One of the nice things about our Git repository is there is a REST API that you can use to automatically learn about updates to those resources. So hopefully everyone is aware of this and is using this and doesn't have any problems accessing these resources as they're updated. All right, so the last thing I'm going to leave you with right before our call ends here is that you can check out all of these revisions on the NEMSIS website. Here's the URL for the page where all the resources are. There's data dictionaries, there's schematrons, there's a nice sort of easy to read view of the schematron, and the rules are also in the data dictionary itself. There's a technical API that sort of breaks out some of the XSD relationships between elements. There's Excel spreadsheets that detail every change we made or did not made and why, as well as all of the original PowerPoints from the initial voting. So if you're curious about any of the minutiae of the revision, definitely check this page out and look at the resources. If that URL is a little hard to remember, if you're on the homepage for nemsis.org, you can find the candidate release on this big all caps URL here right underneath the banner. So you can click through there to find all the details about what we're working on with 3.5. The 3.5 changes should be finalized, will be finalized by the end of September. And then we should have compliance testing open by the end of November. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it back over to Clay.
Thank you, Laurel. Appreciate that very much. Appreciate everybody's willingness to kind of listen through all those changes. Some of them are clinically relevant, others are very technical, but I think all lead to a more kind of flexible standard, but yet stable and hopefully much easier for our clinicians to be able to complete patient care records once we finalize these changes and make sure that we have good, strong business applications and kind of use cases for our developers or software developers to understand how to use these tools. So we're working in that direction as we finish up all of the changes. And I would just ask one last time: are there any questions associated with any of the attributes of the version 3.5.0 release?
Hey, Clay, it's Josh. I was wondering if you could just briefly mention how long we expect it to take for vendors to implement 3.5 and for it to actually be out on the streets.
Yeah, that's a great question. Julianne, could you go to the website on the screen and just go ahead and pull up the timeline if you do that? That'd be helpful for folks to take a look at that. There has been a request for us to be a little bit more cognizant of all of the issues associated with moving the entire nation to a new standard of NEMSIS, and so the timeline has been extended a little bit, but we have been incredibly successful actually at being able to collect data as a nation, which has just been incredibly valuable for many reasons. So here's the current timelines. You can see that we are right there about the third item over from the left on the top of the banner, where we have a final release of NEMSIS coming out the end of September 3.5. Then you can see, as Laurel mentioned, we'll have compliance testing ready for software that's really early to the compliance testing process. I'm sure we won't see anybody in November, but it will be open. And then we will be prepared to start collecting data at the national level in February of 2020. But you can see we expect most of the software products to have 3.5 available beginning in February of 2021. And would like to have the nation moved over to 3.5 in January of 2022. Any questions on the timeline? Okay, looks like we have one more question from Jerry. Hi there, quick question. Are there plans to merge state data submission endpoints into a single submission endpoint? Would help enforce standards and would also make it easier for vendors to interface to submit data. That is an interesting question. I'm not sure that I completely understand what it would mean to have those being submitted as a single endpoint. Feel free to reach out to me, Jerry, if you. I would love to discuss that question with you further. If you go up to the support page there, Julianne. My contact information is listed right there under the NEMSIS project and national programs. Yeah, I would love to hear from you. So yeah, thank you. Feel free to give me a call. Any other questions regarding 3.5? All right, thank you very much for your attention, Julianne. I'll turn it back over to you to close the call.
Thank you, Clay. Our next training will be October 1st, same time, same place. This time, Laurel Baeder will talk to us about software compliance and answer your questions in preparation for vendor testing and software testing. So look for that and get that on your calendar for October 1st. We appreciate you being here this morning, and please, as always, reach out with any questions, concerns, input that you may have. We'd love to hear from you all. Thank you, and have a great day.